We need the space, my son said. And that was it. No anger, no discussion, no moment where I was asked what I wanted. Just those 4 words, spoken over the kitchen counter, as if I were a suitcase left in the hallway. As if my presence, in the house I once bought, painted, and built into a home, had become an obstacle. I'm Ellen Richter, 69, and that was the moment I knew I had been quietly replaced in my own life. Subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Thanks. It was a Saturday. April 15th. I remember because it was the same day the tulips bloomed by the front gate, the ones I'd planted with his daughter 2 springs ago. She loved the pink ones. We called them fairy cups. That morning, she had picked 3 and handed them to me with sticky fingers. But by afternoon, I was told they needed the room. His wife had taken to calling the guest room the office. Never mind that it still held my sewing machine, my books, my hand-stitched quilt folded neatly at the end of the bed. I had moved in with them after my hip surgery, just for a few months. As long as you like, they'd said. Your family. But time has a way of shifting the tone of that word. Family, when inconvenient, starts to mean temporary. I didn't argue. I nodded, slowly. My hands rested on the ceramic teacup I had bought on my honeymoon in 1976, the glaze slightly chipped at the rim. I stared into the tea as it cooled. And I felt the warmth drain from more than just the cup. By the next morning, the energy in the house had changed. She moved quickly, packing up my closet, folding things into boxes I didn't ask for. My son avoided eye contact. He cleaned the garage that day. He does that when he can't find words. They offered to help me find something. Meaning a small apartment, something manageable. Affordable. I wanted to remind them that the only reason they had this home, this very one, was because I had signed over the deed 5 years earlier when they needed a cosigner. But I didn't. That was a different kind of silence. Not fear. Just the realization that I could say everything, and still change nothing. So I called a friend. Miriam. She knew a woman, older, no family, who had an attic room and needed someone to help around the house. It's not much, Miriam had warned. But it's safe. It's yours. I moved in 3 days later. They didn't ask where I went. Not once. The attic was warm. Sloped ceilings, a small window that looked out over a crooked garden fence. The floor creaked in comforting ways, like it remembered stories before mine. There was a twin bed with a quilt, not mine, but someone's, and a small table with a lamp whose light turned everything gold. I sat on that bed the first night and tried to cry. But nothing came. Not anger. Not sadness. Just a strange, quiet awareness that I had overstayed a welcome that was never real. That somewhere between dinner dishes and daycare pickups, I had become too present. Too much. They never said, you don't belong here anymore. They just said, we need the space. And somehow, that was worse. Because it wasn't cruelty. It was convenience. And being discarded for someone's convenience is a grief you cannot explain to people who still believe love is unconditional. They think I'm fine, I suppose. That I'm somewhere quiet, doing well enough. The kind of well that doesn't ask for follow-up questions. The kind of well that lets them sleep at night. But they don't know the sound of this attic when the wind rattles the old window. They don't know how I sit with a cup of tea every morning and imagine the tulips blooming without me. They don't know how, even now, I still check my phone on Sundays. Out of habit. Out of hope. Out of some small echo of motherhood that hasn't quite learned how to stop listening. But I no longer expect. Expectations are a language spoken only by those who still believe they are wanted. I no longer believe I am. And so I begin here. With this voice. With these words. Not to make them listen. But to remember the sound of myself. There was a time when everything I touched was for someone else. The lunches packed before sunrise, crusts cut off just the way he liked them. The school plays I attended in work clothes, rushing straight from the hospital cafeteria after my shift, holding flowers that wilted a little on the bus ride over. The birthday cakes, hand-mixed, hand-decorated, sometimes leaning a bit to one side but always made with care. The nights I sat awake timing fevers, and the mornings I pretended I'd slept. They don't remember those things. But I do. I remember all of it. I remember the day I held my son for the first time, March 8, 1982. He was a quiet baby, serious from the start, with furrowed brows and tiny fists curled near his cheeks like he was already bracing himself for the world. I whispered promises to him that day in the hospital bed. That I would never let him feel alone. That I would be his roof, his ground, his safe place to land. And for decades, I kept those promises. When his father left, slowly, selfishly, the way some men do, I said nothing to make my son hate him. I swallowed the betrayal, even when I was scraping together bills and rationing soup. I worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, just to keep him in his school, around his friends, in the house where his growth chart still marked the doorframe. I never made him feel it. Not the lack, not the weight, not the fear. He only ever saw full lunchboxes and Christmas lights. And that was the point. When he struggled with reading in 2nd grade, I spent every evening with phonics cards and silly rhymes. When he got a scholarship to college but needed extra money for books and rent, I cashed in a savings bond one had been keeping for new kitchen counters. The old ones had a deep crack running across them like a fault line. I ran my hand over that crack every morning for a decade, reminding myself, you chose him. You still choose him. And then came the years when he brought her home, the woman he would marry. I welcomed her. Not because she made it easy, but because it mattered to him. I offered to host their engagement dinner. Cooked for 3 days. Bought candles. Polished the silverware my mother gave me on my wedding day. It was chipped by then, mismatched, but I thought it would mean something. It didn't. When they had their daughter, I brought groceries and casseroles. I washed onesies. I slept on the living room couch for the first week, tiptoeing around in the dark so they could rest. I was careful never to overstep. I waited to be invited, even to hold the baby. Later, they told me how grateful they were. They even joked that they didn't know how they could have done it without me. Turns out, they figured it out just fine. Over time, the calls got shorter. Visits became scheduled. My offers to help were met with polite deflection. Thanks, we've got it, they'd say. Or worse, you don't need to worry about that anymore. As if mothering was something I was supposed to retire from. Still, I stayed nearby. Moved closer when they asked. Sold the house that held every memory, just to be a 10-minute drive instead of 40. I thought proximity would mean inclusion. That if I was close, I'd stay woven into their lives. But being nearby only made it easier to be overlooked in person. I babysat when sitters canceled. I took their dog during vacations. I bought their daughter clothes, always one size ahead, always washed and folded before I gave them. They never asked how I was doing. They assumed I was fine. That I always would be. And I let them. I let them believe I had no needs of my own. Because for so long, I really didn't. My needs were folded into theirs. I never remarried. People assume I must have had options, and maybe I did. But my life was full of my son's life. I didn't want to miss a single beat of it. Every soccer match. Every heartbreak. Every time he called from college just to hear my voice. He used to call me Mama, long after most boys would have switched to Mom. He'd say it when he was sick, or tired, or just needed comfort. Then, one day, it stopped. And I didn't correct him. It's strange how love can shift quietly. How one day, the calls come only out of obligation. The hugs get quicker. The smiles more performative. You catch it in small ways, like when they bring out only 3 mugs for coffee, as if forgetting you're still in the room. There's a special kind of ache in loving people who have outgrown your tenderness. But I never gave less. I just gave more quietly. Even when I moved into their home, I tried to take up as little space as possible. I kept my things contained to one room. I cleaned up after myself. I offered to pay rent, they refused, at first. Then they hinted at it later. I always said yes. Because love, for me, was never measured in what I received. It was in what I was willing to give without asking for return. And I gave everything. My youth. My sleep. My hands. My home. My name, once. Even the house they now call theirs, the house they asked me to leave, it came from me. I co-signed the loan when their credit wasn't strong enough. I offered my savings when their closing costs ran higher than expected. I sat in that bank with a pen in hand, steady as ever, and said, "It's okay. I trust you." I thought they would remember that. But time has a way of erasing the handwriting of mothers. Now, in this attic room, surrounded by borrowed books and chipped teacups, I am remembering it all, not because I want them to feel guilty, but because I need to know I didn't imagine any of it. I was there. I was essential. And somewhere, deep down, they know that. Even if they can no longer say it. It never comes all at once, the erasure. No one wakes up and decides to stop loving you. They just stop needing you in ways that feel small at first. And by the time you notice, it's already too late to point to where it started. For me, it was in the little corrections. "Grandma doesn't eat dairy," my granddaughter once said at the dinner table, spoon halfway to her mouth. Her mother, my daughter-in-law, smiled tightly and said, "It's just a little cream. She'll be fine." I was sitting right there. But they talked around me, not to me. And I said nothing. Just took the bowl and stirred it gently, pretending not to notice that my stomach would hurt all night. That was hurt number 17, I think. I'd already stopped counting by then. There was the time they booked a weekend trip and forgot to tell me. I found out through a neighbor, who waved to me while watering her plants and said, "I didn't know they were going to the coast again." Neither did I. I had been watching their dog that weekend. Sitting by the door like it might swing open at any moment with a surprise, "We thought you'd like to come too." But it didn't. They returned late Sunday and brought me a small bag of saltwater taffy. No note. Just placed it on the table like a souvenir of an unspoken truth: we've moved on. There was the time I baked a peach cobbler and brought it over for Sunday dinner. The recipe was my mother's, handed down in pencil with smudges along the edge. I'd made it dozens of times for my son growing up, it was his favorite. He used to ask for it every birthday, even when he turned 32. But that Sunday, he didn't take a slice. "Too sweet," his wife said, clearing the dishes. I watched the pan go untouched, then into the fridge, then into the trash 3 days later. I knew because I came to return a book and saw it in the bin. Still in the foil. Still whole. They hadn't even cut into it. That was hurt number 34. Some days, it was smaller. A coffee made without asking how I take it. A conversation started in another room without waiting for me to arrive. A family photo posted online where I had been cropped out, not maliciously, just inconveniently. There was never an explosion. Just 100 soft closures. I began to understand the language of omission. They stopped using my name when introducing me, I was just Grandma. Or Mom, for now. They stopped asking what I thought, or what I remembered. My stories grew too long for their pace. My jokes landed in silence. My advice was something to politely nod at and quietly ignore. At first, I made excuses for them. They're tired. Busy. They don't realize. But they did. We always know when we are being phased out. You can feel it in the way your chair becomes the last one taken. In how they clean around your things instead of with them. In how they begin to build a life that no longer has room for you, not with cruelty, but with planning. The quiet hurts compounded like unpaid debts. And I kept paying interest in silence. Even holidays began to feel performative. Christmas morning became a calendar event, scheduled for sometime that week. I stopped bringing wrapped gifts after the third year they were left in the foyer, unopened. I started giving gift cards. And then even that felt too much. I remember one Thanksgiving, I had made green beans with almonds, just as my mother had, just as I had every year. A tradition. The dish was pushed to the edge of the buffet line. Later, when I asked if I could take it back home, I found it already thrown out. Not even the dish washed. Just scraped into the bin, like any other leftover. It wasn't about the beans. It never is. It was about feeling like history in a room full of people trying to forget it. There were emotional absences, too. When my son had surgery, I found out from a mutual friend. It was just a minor thing, she said. They didn't want to worry you. As if worry was a weakness. As if I hadn't been the one who sat beside him through childhood asthma attacks, long nights in emergency rooms, trembling hands holding inhalers. But now I was too fragile. Too far removed. They wanted my silence more than my presence. And eventually, I gave it to them. But before that, there was one last quiet hurt that stayed with me, not because it was cruel, but because it was so ordinary. I came over to drop off a scarf I had knitted for my granddaughter. Pale yellow, soft wool, tiny embroidered daisies along the ends. She had once said she wanted to be a gardener. I left it in a paper bag by the front door. A week later, I saw a photo on social media, her wearing a scarf. But not mine. A store-bought one. Tag still showing. When I asked gently if she liked the scarf, her mother said, "Oh, I think it got lost in the shuffle. But thank you." That was the last thing I ever made for her. 100 quiet hurts. None loud enough to break me. But all of them together? They taught me how to leave. And more importantly, they taught me that I already had. Long before I carried that final box out of their house. Long before they said we need the space. They had been clearing room for a long time. I was just the last one to notice. It came in a manila envelope. No warning, no phone call, just a quiet thud in the mail slot one afternoon, while I was steeping chamomile and watching the rain dust the rooftop outside the attic window. I had already moved out by then. I had already made peace, or so I told myself, with being set aside. But what was inside that envelope unraveled something in me that I hadn't even realized was still holding on. Inside were papers from the county assessor's office, routine, dry, bureaucratic. Property tax reassessments. My name was listed on the original deed, still faintly, in a footnote at the bottom of one page. I hadn't looked at any of it since the day I helped them buy the house. The same house they now asked me to vacate like I was some overextended guest. I kept flipping. And then I saw it. A quitclaim deed. Dated 3 weeks after I moved out. Signed by both my son and his wife. Filed without a single call, a single mention. My name was removed entirely. Just like that. Gone. They hadn't even waited a month. The house I had helped them buy, co-signing the loan with my pension savings when the bank needed more collateral. The home I'd spent hours in, folding their laundry, watching their daughter so they could sleep, cooking when they were too tired to move. I'd poured money into that kitchen renovation, and time into that garden, digging with knees that ached for days afterward. All because I thought love meant investing in someone else's comfort. And now? Now it was legally, officially, not mine. I wasn't expecting ownership. I had given that up willingly. What stung wasn't the loss of the house. It was the quiet efficiency with which they scrubbed me from its story. No thank you. No acknowledgement. Just a signature and a date filed with the county. I sat at the table, fingers resting against the edge of the paper, and I could feel the quiet line they'd crossed. This wasn't about needing space anymore. This was about rewriting the past. They wanted to erase the part where I mattered. There was something final in that page. Not cruel, not in the way people imagine cruelty. There was no betrayal written in red. No name-calling. Just bureaucracy. Just clean paperwork. Like I had never been there at all. I didn't call them. I didn't ask for an explanation. What could they say? It's standard procedure? You weren't living there anymore? We didn't think it mattered? That's what hurt the most, they didn't think it mattered. They didn't think I mattered. They thought they could rearrange reality in a filing cabinet, and that I would just fade from the record. From memory. I looked at that deed for a long time. Thought of the spring I helped them move in, barefoot in the grass, painting trim while my granddaughter splashed in the kiddie pool. Thought of the summer I strung fairy lights along the back fence, because they hadn't had time to decorate, and how proud they looked showing it off to friends. Thought of every morning I had made coffee before they woke up, leaving it on the counter with a small folded napkin. No one remembers the napkin. But I do. I folded those little squares just so, a tiny act of care. You don't forget that kind of giving, not if you ever truly saw it. Apparently, they never really did. That night, I placed the envelope in the drawer beside my bed. I didn't shred it. I didn't burn it. I kept it. Not to brood. But to remember. Not out of bitterness, but as proof. That I had been there. That I did help. That it wasn't just a feeling or a dream. That the story had once had my name in the margins, even if it had since been edited out. Later that week, Miriam, the friend who'd helped me find the attic, came by with apple scones. We sat in silence for a while, drinking tea and listening to the soft hum of the rain. She asked me how I was doing, really. I told her, quietly, they crossed a line. She didn't ask what I meant. She just nodded. There's a language among women who have been quietly set aside. You don't have to explain the shape of the wound. We know it by the way the eyes linger on old photos. By how carefully we fold our hands in our lap, as if still holding something we were never allowed to drop. The truth is, I might have forgiven them for forgetting birthdays, for choosing convenience, for losing interest in my stories. I might have even forgiven the silence. But the moment they erased my name from the place I helped build? That was different. That was erasure with intent. I wasn't angry. Not in the way people imagine anger, no yelling, no slamming doors. I just felt something inside me shift. Like a door closing softly at the end of a long hallway. I started sleeping with my phone turned off. I stopped checking the family group chat, which had become little more than appointment reminders and pictures I was never in. I canceled the holiday card I used to send, the one with the photo of the garden from the house I no longer had any right to. And most importantly, I changed my will. Not out of revenge. But out of understanding. Understanding that legacy isn't about blood. It's about memory. It's about who holds your story with care. And I decided, in that moment, that my story would be passed down to someone who still believed in thank yous. In eye contact. In napkins folded just so. I didn't know who that would be yet. But I knew it wouldn't be them. The silence began with my own name. I stopped saying it when I introduced myself to new people. Not because I was ashamed of who I was, but because I was tired of being followed by the question, "Do you have children?" It's a kind question. It's meant kindly. But it cuts like paper. Thin, sharp, and too quick to see coming. I started saying, I'm just Ellen. No last name. No history attached. Just Ellen, as if that alone was enough. And for the first time in my life, I let that be true. I didn't call my son after the deed was changed. I didn't ask why they had erased me from something I helped build. I didn't ask how they were, or how the tulips were blooming this year. I didn't ask anything at all. I went silent. Not out of punishment. Not to make them feel anything. I went silent because I had finally realized that speaking had never made me heard. That was the thing I had to learn the hard way, that a mother's voice, especially as she grows older, begins to sound like background music. Familiar, gentle, always there, and easy to turn down. So I turned it down myself. I stopped texting first. I stopped sending birthday cards. I stopped just checking in to remind them I existed. I stopped forwarding articles I thought they'd enjoy, stopped buying little things just because, stopped responding to one-word messages that said THX instead of thank you. I watched my silence become space. And then, eventually, absence. No one called to ask why I was quiet. They noticed, I could tell by the occasional awkward text, by the way my name started appearing in the family group chat again. We should invite Mom, one of them said once, in a message clearly not meant for me but accidentally copied in. I didn't respond. That was the moment I knew I had finally stepped outside of the role they had confined me to, the ever-present fixer, the fallback, the background hum of unconditional support. The silence gave me room to think. I began sorting through my life like an attic full of boxes. Not just physical things, though there were many, but emotional things, too. I made lists of what I had carried, memories, names, family recipes, old apologies. And then, piece by piece, I began letting them go. I opened my bank account and started making small changes. I canceled automatic transfers I had set up years ago to help cover their mortgage, money they never acknowledged. I started moving small amounts into my own savings. I labeled the account, for joy. Not emergencies. Not for later. For joy. I went to the library and got a new card with my new address. I walked through every aisle slowly, touching the spines of books I had always meant to read but never had time for. I checked out 3, none of them recommended by anyone else. That felt important. I started visiting the cafe around the corner on Tuesday afternoons. The girl behind the counter, a college student with chipped nail polish and a tired smile, began to remember my order. Earl Grey, extra hot, she'd say before I asked. I gave her a real smile for that. It had been a while. One Thursday, I went to a community legal workshop held at the local rec center. Just to ask a few questions. Just to understand what I was allowed to do, what was mine to keep, what I was free to change. The attorney was young, but attentive. She wore glasses with tortoiseshell frames and listened without interrupting. I told her I wanted to update my will. She asked if I wanted to include my family. I said, not the ones you're thinking of. That night, I slept with a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. A quiet that wasn't lonely, it was dignified. Like finally stepping out of a crowded room you no longer recognized and closing the door behind you without needing to slam it. I planted basil on the windowsill. I bought a set of soft pencils and began sketching again, just outlines at first. Leaves. Teacups. A window with lace curtains. My hand was stiff, but it remembered. I'd forgotten how much beauty lived in the act of looking closely. The silence taught me to see again. Not them. Not their faces or their approval. But myself. I saw the way my reflection had softened. The way my hands, though lined, still moved with precision. I saw the way light pooled in the corners of the attic room in the morning, golden and patient. I saw that I didn't need to be spoken to feel real. And I realized that my silence was no longer the absence of love. It was the presence of self-respect. When they finally did reach out, a text from my daughter-in-law that said, "Hey, we were thinking of doing dinner sometime next week," I stared at it for a long while. Then I put the phone down. I didn't delete it. I just let it sit. Because silence, I've learned, is not something you recover from quickly. It becomes a rhythm. A language of its own. And mine was finally fluent. It began with my shoes. I bought a new pair, soft brown leather with firm soles and just the right amount of give. They weren't on sale. I didn't ask anyone if they thought they looked too old or too much. I tried them on in the shop, walked 3 small loops, looked at myself in the mirror, and bought them. Not because I needed them. But because I liked the way they made me feel, grounded, certain, like I could leave a room without apologizing for the echo. It had been almost 4 months since I left their house. 4 months since they told me, without saying it directly, that love had an expiration date. 4 months since I'd heard my granddaughters laugh or been offered a cup of tea made by someone else's hands. But grief has a rhythm, and after enough time, it begins to settle into the corners instead of flooding the room. I didn't set out to reinvent myself. That's not what women my age do. We reclaim. We restore. We return to the parts of ourselves that were paused for the sake of someone else's comfort. I started by repainting the attic's window trim. It was a soft green, the color of eucalyptus leaves. I painted it slowly, carefully, with hands that remembered what it meant to make something lovely for no reason but my own joy. The landlady noticed a few days later and left a note, "It looks beautiful. Thank you." It was the first time in months that someone thanked me without expectation attached. I went back to the ceramic studio Miriam had once taken me to. This time, I enrolled in a 6-week course. Thursday mornings. Wheel throwing. I hadn't worked clay since high school, back when art class was the 1 hour a week I didn't feel invisible. My first bowl came out lopsided, but I kept it. My second was better. My third, I gave away to a woman in the class who said it reminded her of the ocean. That felt like something I wanted to be part of, someone else's quiet happiness. There's something sacred about making things with your hands. Not to be sold. Not to impress. Just to say, I was here, and this shape is mine. I began waking early again, not out of obligation, but desire. I'd make a small breakfast. Toast with marmalade, eggs just barely set, and a mug of tea steeped longer than I'd normally allow. I sat by the window and let the morning light find my face. I was no longer in anyone's way. No one was waiting for me to be finished so they could begin. The silence felt earned. A week after I updated my will, I made another decision. I reached out to a girl named Sophia, the daughter of a nurse I'd once worked with. Sophia was studying social work, paying her way through school while caring for her own grandmother at home. We'd spoken once, briefly, at a fundraiser years ago. I remembered her kindness. Her eyes that listened. I asked her if she'd help me set up a small fund. Nothing grand, just enough to support a few women each year. Women over 60, starting over. Women who had been asked to leave the room they built. Women who knew how to hold a family together but were never handed the gratitude to go with it. We called it the Second Bloom Fund. She cried when I told her why. It wasn't revenge. It was a seed. Something planted in the soil of my own loss. And it grew. I started writing again, too. Not books or letters. Just small reflections. Observations. One-liners I would have said aloud to someone, if I still had someone to talk to over morning coffee. Things like, the tulips bloom, even when no one watches. A woman doesn't disappear when she stops being needed. Silence is a room with a door only you hold the key to. I filled 3 notebooks in 2 months. I didn't tell anyone. It wasn't for them. It was for me. I also began to dress with a kind of softness I had forgotten I deserved. Linen blouses. A long gray coat with deep pockets. I wore a small gold pin shaped like a crescent moon, even though it clashed with everything. I wore it because I wanted to. I wore it because no one told me not to. And one day, a small but shimmering day, I took the train to a nearby town I had never visited. I packed a lunch, brought my sketchbook, and walked until I found a bench overlooking a field of late summer clover. I sat for hours. No phone. No noise. Just the gentle hum of wind and grass, and the kind of peace that arrives when you stop trying to be someone else's definition of useful. I moved differently now. I no longer entered rooms with shrinking shoulders. I no longer waited for an invitation to speak. I began answering, not explaining. Saying no without apology. Saying yes without permission. And slowly, I began to trust again. Not in them, not in the ones who let me go. But in the women I met on park benches, in pottery studios, in line at the post office. Women who smiled when they saw me. Not because I had anything to offer, but because I was there. Because I existed. And because that, somehow, was enough. One morning, I received a letter in the mail. Handwritten. No return address. Inside was a note on plain paper. I heard what you did for Sophia's fund. Thank you. It gave me hope. There was no signature. But I held the letter for a long time. Because sometimes healing comes not in the form of reconciliation, but in recognition. And sometimes, it arrives when you least expect it. In a new pair of shoes. In a clay bowl. In a train ride to a place where no one knows your name. I no longer needed to be the center of anyone's story. I had finally returned to my own. It didn't happen all at once, but they started to feel it, the space I left behind. Not like a slammed door or a stormed-out goodbye. Just absence. Like warmth that slowly drains from a room when the fire dies, long after the embers are gone. I didn't hear it from them directly. Of course not. That's not how families like mine operate. Feelings are folded under polite smiles. Guilt is wrapped in gifts sent late. And regret arrives in the form of second-hand stories, neighbors, cousins, old coworkers. They asked around, apparently. Where I'd gone. If I was doing okay. Not to invite me back. Just to confirm I hadn't vanished in a way that might make them look bad. I hadn't vanished. I had simply stopped filling in the cracks they'd never noticed were mine to begin with. It started small. The first Christmas without me. I heard through Miriam that the dinner was underwhelming. The stuffing was dry. The green beans burned. The pie store-bought. It just wasn't the same, someone had murmured. My son had apparently shrugged and said, Mom always made it look easy. I had. That was the point. I made it look easy so they wouldn't see how hard it was. The years I worked 2 jobs and still made handmade place cards for the table. The nights I stayed up past midnight sewing costumes, only to wake at 5 to make lunches. The way I filled every silence with care, every space with softness. Now, the spaces were louder. I heard my granddaughter had started asking why I didn't come around anymore. That stung more than anything else. Because she still remembered me as someone who showed up. She hadn't yet learned the version of family that edits people out. The version her parents had embraced. They told her I was busy. That I had a new place. Maybe they believed that. Maybe they needed to. But I knew the truth, they missed what I gave, not who I was. There's a difference. When I lived in their house, I made it whole. I repaired the curtains when they frayed. Replaced cracked tiles with my pension money. Stocked the pantry with extras because I knew which cereals their daughter liked when she couldn't sleep. I remembered birthdays, allergies, anniversaries. I reminded them of doctor's appointments. Sent thank you notes on their behalf when they forgot. I was the cushion between them and the consequences of their own neglect. Without me, things began to unravel. I heard they missed a tuition deadline for the daycare scholarship. That their dog developed a skin condition and no one noticed for weeks. That my son lost a promotion at work because he forgot a critical report and had no one to triple-check his calendar. I didn't smile at the news. This wasn't vindication. It was validation. I had mattered. And they hadn't seen it until I stepped out of the frame. Even socially, I had been their anchor. When people asked about his family, my son would say, "My mother lives with us. She helps out a lot." That sentence did more than explain my presence, it made them look generous. It made them seem close-knit. It made them feel like good people. Now, when asked, he just says, "We don't really see her much." His voice falters, I'm told. He doesn't say why. He just lets the subject move on. But that awkward silence? That's the shape I left behind. A few weeks ago, I ran into a former coworker of his, a woman I'd met once at a company dinner years ago. She paused, smiled too widely, and said, "We miss seeing you in the family holiday photos." I smiled right back and replied, "Sometimes people forget to leave space for the things that hold them up." She blinked. I kept walking. I've heard they argue more now. About money. About schedules. About who's supposed to do what. And no one seems to know when the shift happened, when the warmth faded, when things began to feel a little colder. But I know. Because for years, I was the silent glue. I absorbed the tension. Smoothed the rough edges. I was the one who stepped in when they stepped out. I held it all together, gently, lovingly, and thanklessly. Now, I hold only myself. They lost more than a person when they told me they needed the space. They lost their buffer. Their quiet backup. Their invisible safety net. And the thing about safety nets is, you don't realize how high you were until the net's gone. I don't watch from a place of spite. I don't keep tabs to gloat. I listen because news still finds its way to me, like wind under the door. And I let it pass. I let it be. They had a mother who gave them everything. Not money, not prestige. But steadiness. Loyalty. Thoughtfulness. And now, they have to live with the version of life where those things don't arrive on their own. Where no one clears the table without being asked. Where no one remembers the way you like your tea or folds the towels the way you prefer. Maybe they'll learn. Maybe they won't. That's no longer mine to carry. Because now, I am not their fallback. I am not their quiet extra room. I am not their soft landing. I am just Ellen. And the absence they feel? That's not loneliness. That's the echo of everything I gave, now gone. It started as a scribble in the margin of a library receipt. One of those chilly mornings when sunlight looks warm but isn't. I'd just come back from my usual walk. The one where I loop past the bakery, down by the duck pond, and back through the alley lined with overgrown roses. I had stopped to pick up a book on my hold list, and the librarian had slipped the due date slip inside without a word. It fluttered out when I opened to the first chapter. That's when I wrote it, the sentence that had been circling my mind for days. I was not too much. They were simply too little. I stared at those words for a long time. Then I wrote another. And another. By the end of the week, I had 3 full pages of phrases, fragments, and half-formed thoughts. All in different inks, different sizes, written on scraps, the backs of shopping lists, the corner of a utility bill, a napkin from the cafe. None of it was meant to be a letter. Not at first. But one evening, after washing the last teacup and drawing the curtains, I sat down at the small writing desk in the corner of the attic and pulled out proper paper. The kind with weight to it, cream-colored, a slight texture under your fingers. I smoothed it out, uncapped my fountain pen, and wrote at the top, Dear Ellen, I had never written to myself before. I'd written birthday cards, condolence notes, thank yous and apologies and shopping lists a mile long. But never something that said, you. You matter. You have always mattered. The words came slower than I expected. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted to be careful. I wanted to speak to the version of me that still flinched when someone said, "You're overreacting." The version that still replayed the tone in my son's voice that day in the kitchen, as if I were a box in the way. Here's what I wrote: Dear Ellen, you have held so much without complaint. You kept going even when no one noticed you were tired. You filled the spaces between people, smoothed their silences, made everyone else's comfort more important than your own. You were never loud. You never asked to be seen. But you deserved to be. I want you to know, your gentleness was not a weakness. Your presence was not disposable. You were not a burden in that house. You were a blessing they mistook for background. You were the one who remembered. The one who adjusted. The one who stayed. They may have chosen to forget, but that does not mean you were forgettable. You left with grace. And that grace? It belongs to you. It does not make them right. It makes you strong. So don't spend one more moment apologizing for how much you loved. You were not too much. They were simply not ready for the depth of you. You gave your life in small, quiet gifts, meals made, toys mended, birthdays remembered. You left parts of yourself everywhere, like breadcrumbs. And when no one came looking, you thought maybe you were wrong to have given so much. But you weren't. Because love is not wrong, even when it goes unreturned. You can be proud of your giving. And now, you are allowed to rest. You are allowed to grow new things, things that have nothing to do with being useful, needed, or missed. Grow beauty. Grow stillness. Grow joy. And when they think of you, and they will, let them feel the shape of the space you filled. Let them feel what it's like now, without you. You don't owe them a re-entry. You only owe yourself a home. And Ellen? You have already started to build it. Love me. When I finished, I didn't cry. I just sat there, hands folded in my lap, the room quiet around me. The air felt different somehow. Not lighter, but more mine. I had said the words no one else ever had. And hearing them, even in my own voice, was like being stitched back together. I placed the letter in a small wooden box on my dresser. The same box where I keep my mother's locket, an old theater stub from 1971, and the photo of my son when he was 4, cheeks round, smile easy, one hand reaching toward the camera. I didn't seal the letter. I wanted to be able to read it again. And I have. Not every day. Not even every week. But on the days when silence starts to feel like punishment instead of peace, I open it. I read it aloud. I remind myself that even if the world didn't applaud me, I was still worthy of the stage I once held for others. Something changed after that letter. Not outside. The world didn't shift. The phone didn't ring. There was no apology at the door. But something inside me unclenched. I began walking with my shoulders back. I caught my reflection in the cafe window one afternoon and didn't look away. I stood a little taller when the barista asked my name and I said, Ellen. Not just as a formality, but as a truth. The kind of truth that needs no defense. I no longer trace the calendar for their birthdays. I mark my own now. With soft candles and lemon cake. I no longer ask who's missing me. I ask where I feel most present. And the answer, more and more, is here. In this attic room, with its green trim and chipped mugs. In this new life, one quiet, strong breath at a time. In this body, still soft, still whole, still entirely mine. That letter was not an end. It was a beginning. The beginning of seeing myself, not through their eyes, but through my own. These days, the mornings come slowly. I wake without an alarm, stretch in bed while the light warms the ceiling, and listen to the old house settle itself around me. The attic creaks in its familiar places. The window hums when the wind picks up. Somewhere below, the kettle rattles on the stove, left warming by habit. I always said it the night before, just like I used to do for them. Except now, it's only for me. And that's enough. I rise when I'm ready. No small feet pounding the stairs. No lists waiting for my attention. No voice asking where the spare socks are or what's for dinner. My slippers are right where I left them. My robe still smells faintly of lavender. I step into the kitchen, take down my favorite mug, the one with the chipped handle I keep meaning to fix but never do, and brew a strong cup of Earl Grey. I stir in honey, not because anyone else likes it that way, but because I do. The garden outside is overgrown. Not wild, just full. Morning glories climb the trellis. The thyme has escaped its pot, sneaking into the rosemary. I don't tame it much. I like that it grows on its own terms. I think I understand that now in a way I never did before. I walk the perimeter sometimes with a small notebook in hand. I jot down things I notice. The way the bees return to the same bloom, the sound of leaves whispering when no one's listening, the odd, dignified way the hydrangeas begin to dry without losing their color. Most days, I write something, not for anyone else, but just to put my mind to paper. Reflections. Bits of memory. Soft questions with no answers. I write about the sound of drawers closing, the feeling of carrying too much in silence, the weight of things unsaid. And sometimes I write about joy, the quiet kind. The kind that doesn't depend on being seen. I mail letters, too. Not to my family. That season is over. But to the women in my life who stayed, the ones who didn't turn away when things became uncomfortable or inconvenient. Miriam gets one every month, even though she lives close enough to visit. I like giving her something to open. Once a week, I volunteer at the community center, sorting donated clothes, folding baby blankets, arranging items on shelves. I've started teaching a gentle yoga class for older women. We sit mostly in chairs, talk more than we stretch. The other day, someone laughed so hard she cried, and when I asked what was funny, she said, "I don't even remember, I just forgot what it felt like to laugh in a room full of women." That's reason enough. I don't speak much about my past. Not because I'm ashamed, but because I no longer need to prove I survived it. Every breath I take is proof. Every day I wake up and choose kindness, to myself, to the stranger who cuts me off in traffic, to the girl at the bakery with trembling hands, is proof that love doesn't have to make you small. Sometimes, people ask if I regret it. Leaving. Going silent. Starting over so late in life. They ask with tilted heads, as if they expect sadness to rise up in my throat like smoke. But I don't regret it. What I regret is how long I waited to listen to myself. What I regret is all the times I translated disrespect into misunderstanding. All the times I gave second chances to people who never gave me a first thought. All the birthdays I remembered for people who couldn't even remember how I take my tea. But regret is not the same as bitterness. I hold no bitterness. Only distance. Only peace. There was a time I couldn't imagine being this alone. When silence felt like punishment. When the absence of calls or invitations or holiday plans made me feel like a tree with no roots. Now, I know I was never rootless. I was planted deep, just in soil they never learned how to value. And now that I've grown in a space where I'm not being trimmed back to make others more comfortable, I've found a kind of bloom I never thought was meant for women like me. A late bloom. But a bloom all the same. The other day, I passed my son in town. He didn't see me. Or maybe he did. Either way, I didn't wave. I just watched as he loaded groceries into the back of a car, his daughter in the passenger seat, tapping on a phone. I wondered if she still remembers the names of the tulips we planted. If she still says fairy cups in the spring. I didn't feel anger. Only softness. The kind of softness that comes from knowing I no longer need anything from them, not apology, not acknowledgement, not an open door. I gave them all I had. And now I give myself what's left. It's enough. This quiet life, of books and tea, of garden paths and handwritten notes, of Sunday mornings and warm socks, it is small, but it is sacred. Because it's mine. Entirely mine. And for the first time, I'm not living at the edge of someone else's comfort. I'm living at the center of my own. I wasn't angry. I was finally empty, and that was beautiful.